In the summer of 1839, in a quiet corner of rural New York, a child entered the world who would one day hold more economic power than entire nations. But nothing about John Davison Rockefeller's beginning hinted at greatness. His life began not in the halls of wealth, but in a sagging wooden farmhouse that creaked under the weight of poverty, uncertainty, and a father whose very existence felt like a rumor. John's father, William Devil Bill Rockefeller, was a man as dazzling as he was dangerous. To the outside world, he appeared charming, tall, wiry, with a mischievous glint in his eye, and the confidence of a man who could talk anyone into anything. But behind closed doors, he was a restless wanderer, a medicine peddler, an illusionist, a trickster, and a phantom who drifted in and out of his family's life with the unpredictability of a storm. Bill was a master of reinvention. Sometimes he introduced himself as Dr. William Livingston, a traveling healer selling miracle tonics that cured nothing but the gullibility of his customers. Other times, he was a hunter, a gambler, a ventriloquist, whatever identity he needed to extract money from strangers. There were seasons when he vanished for weeks or months, leaving his wife Eliza and their children with empty cupboards and unpaid debts. And then, with theatrical flair, he would suddenly return home in a fine carriage, pockets full of cash, showering the children with toys they could not afford and promises he would never keep. This strange rhythm, a life of hunger punctuated by moments of sudden luxury, left young John confused but observant. It taught him an early, harsh truth. Prosperity was unstable, and those who did not control money were controlled by those who did. His mother, Eliza, was the polar opposite of her husband, soft-spoken, yet immovably strong. A devout Baptist, she clung to her faith as if it were the only solid ground in her life. While Bill played the role of a wandering charlatan, Eliza plowed the fields, tended to the animals, and instilled in her children a rigid code of discipline, honesty, and self-restraint. If Bill was chaos, she was order. If he was deception, she was truth. From a young age, John worked beside her in the fields, his small hands blistered from plowing stubborn soil. He quickly became a second parent to his younger siblings. Responsibility wasn't something assigned to him, it was something life forced upon him. But even in boyhood, John had a mind calibrated toward opportunity. When he stumbled upon a nest of turkey eggs deep in the woods, most children would have seen breakfast. John saw capital. He raised the birds, sold the adults for a profit, and kept a few hens to repeat the cycle. Soon, he was earning real money, more than most boys his age had ever touched. Still, the family situation only worsened. When John was 10, his father was publicly accused of sexually assaulting a young woman, a scandal that poisoned the Rockefeller name. Their reputation shattered. The family fled town under cover of disgrace. One would expect the scandal to humble Devil Bill, perhaps force him to become a responsible husband and father. Instead, he sank even deeper into deception. While traveling under his fake name, he married another woman in a distant state, never telling either wife that the other existed. The double life stretched him further away from home, leaving Eliza and the children nearly abandoned. Paradoxically, his absence meant more responsibility for John. By his early teens, John was the family treasurer, negotiator, laborer, and moral anchor. He balanced school with hard farm labor and still found time to make small business deals around the neighborhood, lending tiny sums, tracking debts in neat handwriting, and calculating profits with the precision of a merchant twice his age. Each year, more siblings were born. Each year, Bill was gone longer. Each year, John's sense that he was the true head of household grew stronger. By 16, he dreamed of college. It was the one path that could lift him above the life he'd been forced into. But dreams cost money, and the Rockefellers had none. With a heavy heart, he dropped out of school 2 months before graduation to search for work in the city of Cleveland. He walked from business to business, presenting himself with a firm handshake, crisp penmanship samples, and a determination unusual in someone his age. But once employers discovered he was only 16, they laughed him out the door. For 6 weeks, he endured rejection after rejection, each one chipping away at the false confidence he'd built to mask the fear inside, a fear that he would fail his mother, fail his siblings, fail himself. But then, one morning, a small firm finally agreed to give him a chance. They didn't ask about his age. They didn't promise him a future. They simply handed him a ledger and told him to begin immediately. That moment, September 26th, became the most sacred day of his life. He celebrated it every year, calling it Job Day, the day he earned his place in the world through effort rather than birth. In that cramped office, hunched over ink-stained pages, he discovered something extraordinary. He loved numbers. He loved order. He loved systems. He loved watching debts become assets, chaos become structure. And holding a $4,000 check in his hand for the first time, more wealth than he had ever imagined, he whispered to himself a private mantra he would repeat every morning. I am bound to be rich. This wasn't arrogance. It was a survival vow. A vow born from years of hunger, abandonment, instability, and the lesson his father had unintentionally carved into his soul. If you do not master money, it will master you. And so, from the ashes of a fractured childhood, the ambitions of a titan began to form. John Rockefeller's first job did not make him wealthy, but it did something far more important. It taught him how money moved, how it breathed, how it flowed through a business like blood through a living organism. And as he sat at his desk day after day, entering figures into ledgers with perfect precision, he began to see patterns, mistakes other men made, inefficiencies they tolerated, opportunities they were too complacent to seize. But one thing the job did not give him was security. A recession hit. Clients vanished. Revenues fell like loose bricks from a collapsing wall. And after 2 years of hard work, one of the firm's founders quit, drowning in debt. Suddenly, vast responsibilities fell into the hands of the teenage bookkeeper who had once been laughed out of interviews for being too young. Now he was managing the company's accounts almost single-handedly. Yet instead of fear, Rockefeller felt an almost electric clarity. The firm might not survive, but he knew he would. For 2 years he had studied business from the inside. He understood suppliers, margins, the rhythm of markets. His confidence grew quietly, steadily, almost dangerously. He began dreaming of something unthinkable, creating a business of his own. John had made only modest savings, but they felt monumental compared to the emptiness of his childhood. More importantly, he had gained the trust of a man who would shape the next decade of his life, Maurice B. Clark, a 28-year-old chemist with sharp instincts and a restless ambition that matched John's. Clark approached him with an idea: start a produce commission business. Buy grain, fish, meat, beans, anything the farmers could bring to the city, and resell it with a margin. The work would be grueling, the risks high, the profits uncertain. But Rockefeller did not hesitate. In 1859, the two men formed Clark and Rockefeller. Their office was small, their capital limited, their experience barely enough to fill a pamphlet, but they had something that mattered more: resolve. The early days were relentless. Rockefeller walked miles each day, trying to land new clients. He tracked every penny, every debt, every order, with an obsession that bordered on religious devotion. Clark, older and more confident, handled the chemistry and supply lines. Together they made a formidable pair, one meticulous and coldly analytical, the other charismatic and bold. Business grew, but slowly. They needed more capital to scale. And so the pair began using a tactic that would foreshadow the ruthless genius Rockefeller would one day unleash on the world. If they wanted a $5,000 loan, they publicly announced that the firm was preparing to invest $10,000. The illusion of wealth created credibility, and credibility created actual wealth. Banks opened their doors, lines of credit appeared, and then the nation exploded. The Civil War tore the United States apart, but for Cleveland businessmen, it created an economic boom. Prices soared. Demand for food quadrupled. Clark and Rockefeller found themselves in the right place at the right time. They made, in a single year, more than many men earned in a lifetime. Rockefeller, who only months earlier had been counting pennies, now watched profits cascade across his balance sheets like a flood. Yet he was not satisfied, not even close. It was during this boom that Rockefeller met a man whose discovery would change the trajectory of his life. Samuel Andrews, a chemist experimenting with refining crude oil into kerosene. Before electricity, kerosene was gold in liquid form. It lit homes, streets, factories. It burned cleaner and brighter than raw oil. And Andrews had mastered a critical technique, purifying crude oil using sulfuric acid, producing kerosene far superior to anything most refiners could make. He needed investment. Rockefeller and Clark needed a future. They lent him $4,000. It was meant to be a side venture, a quiet experiment. Instead, it became their main business almost overnight. The refinery made money faster than their produce operations ever could. Henderson's barrels sold out as soon as they were filled. Shipments to the East Coast were demanded in quantities the partners could barely supply. Rockefeller studied the numbers, his greatest gift, and saw something that others didn't. This wasn't a boom. It was a revolution. The world had just discovered a cheaper, cleaner replacement for whale oil, and the first man to build an empire around it would become unimaginably wealthy. But the oil industry was chaos. Wildcatters swarmed Pennsylvania, drilling frantically where they believed oil hid beneath the soil. Entire towns sprang up overnight and vanished just as quickly. Prices whiplashed from 10 cents to $14 a barrel in a single season. No one knew how long the wells would last. No one knew whether the boom would die as quickly as it began. Clark saw risk. Rockefeller saw destiny. The two partners found themselves at a crossroads. In 1865, after months of tension, Clark demanded to sell his share of the business and exit the volatile oil industry. Maurice Clark, older and perhaps wiser, feared the instability of this new market. Rockefeller, younger but far more ambitious, felt that fear was a luxury he could not afford. The two men agreed to settle the matter at auction, each bidding to buy out the other. The bidding began cautiously, then escalated, then detonated. Clark offered $60,000. Rockefeller countered $65,000. Clark raised. Rockefeller raised again. His heart pounded. His mouth went dry. The room swelled with heat. Each bid was more money than he had ever seen. Finally, at $72,500, a sum equal to more than $1 million today, Rockefeller won. He had no idea how he would pay it, but he knew one thing. He would build his fortune on oil, or he would be buried by it. Within days, news arrived that confirmed his wildest hopes. A new, massive oil field had been discovered in Pennsylvania. The market exploded. The industry expanded. And Rockefeller, now sole owner of the refinery, realized that his mantra, "I am bound to be rich," was no longer simply a vow. It was a plan. He expanded the refinery. He improved efficiency. He cut waste, calculated margins with machine-like precision, and demanded excellence from everyone who worked under him. And as the profits grew, so did his vision. He wanted more control, more power. more certainty in a world defined by chaos. The refinery had become far more than a business. It was the seed of an empire that would soon be known by a name that would terrify competitors, dominate markets, and reshape global industry: Standard Oil. But before Rockefeller could build it, he needed something even more important than money: a partner who believed, as he did, that business was not business at all, but war. The refinery that Rockefeller built after buying out Maurice Clark did more than produce kerosene. It produced conviction. And with each passing month, that conviction hardened into something sharper, colder, and infinitely more dangerous: the belief that he alone was capable of organizing the chaotic oil industry. The boomtowns of Pennsylvania were overflowing with amateur refiners who lacked discipline, capital, or strategy. They polluted rivers, wasted oil, underpriced each other, and lived from one lucky strike to the next. Rockefeller despised chaos, and he was ready to eliminate it by eliminating the people who caused it. To build his empire, he needed help from someone who wasn't afraid to make enemies, someone who understood that the quickest way to win a market was not through competition, but domination. That man appeared in the form of Henry Flagler. Flagler was everything Rockefeller respected: relentless, intelligent, and utterly untroubled by the moral dilemmas that sent lesser businessmen into sleepless nights. Where Rockefeller had discipline, Flagler had ruthlessness. And together, they formed a business partnership that would soon be compared to a military command, not a commercial enterprise. With Flagler by his side, Rockefeller renamed the business Standard Oil, a bold declaration of what he intended to achieve. His kerosene, he insisted, would become the standard of the world. And to ensure that happened, he needed to control not just production, but distribution. The lifeline of the oil industry was the railroad. Whoever dominated the railroads dominated the prices. Whoever dominated the prices dominated the market. And Rockefeller intended to dominate everything. At that time, 3 railroad giants transported the majority of America's oil: the New York Central, the Erie Railroad, and the Pennsylvania Railroad, the most powerful of them all. The Pennsylvania Railroad held little interest in refining oil in Cleveland. For them, transporting crude oil directly to major East Coast cities was far more profitable, so they announced that they were withdrawing from Cleveland entirely. Panic spread like wildfire. Dozens of small refineries immediately collapsed or fled the city. Cleveland's refining future looked doomed. But Rockefeller saw opportunity. The withdrawal of the Pennsylvania Railroad left its 2 rivals in a desperate position. The Erie and New York Central Railroads had invested heavily in Cleveland, and now their lines were sitting idle. They needed oil more than oil needed them, and Rockefeller used their desperation as leverage. He negotiated secret deals, rebates, that allowed Standard Oil to ship at drastically reduced prices. Where competitors paid the official rate, Rockefeller paid a fraction. He also secured guaranteed capacity, 60 carloads a day, every day. The railroads swallowed their pride because they needed the business. But the effects were devastating for Rockefeller's competitors. With shipping costs now far lower than anyone else's, Rockefeller launched the first of many price wars. He slashed the price of Standard Oil kerosene. Competitors tried to follow, but they couldn't. Their costs were higher, their margins thinner, their operations less efficient. Within months, several refiners went bankrupt. Rockefeller bought their equipment, hired their workers, absorbed their clients. And once the competitors were gone, he quietly raised the prices again, higher than before. The strategy was brutal, but brutally effective. Standard Oil became the dominant refinery in Cleveland, then the dominant refinery in the state, then the largest in the nation. But Rockefeller wasn't finished. In 1872, he engineered one of the boldest and most controversial schemes ever attempted in American business history: the South Improvement Company. In a secret alliance between the biggest railroads and a handful of chosen refiners, Standard Oil secured not only massive rebates, but something even more sinister: drawbacks. Every time a rival refinery shipped a barrel of oil on the railroads, Standard Oil got a cut of the fee. Rockefeller was now profiting from his competitor's existence. And if that wasn't enough, the railroads also agreed to hand over confidential shipment information. Rockefeller would know exactly who his competitors were selling to, how much they charged, and how often they shipped. It was corporate espionage disguised as logistics. "This will end all competition," one executive remarked privately. And that was the point. When news of the arrangement leaked to the public, America erupted. Refiners protested, miners shut down wells, railroad tracks were torn up, oil shipments were hijacked, threats turned to violence. The plan collapsed in less than 2 months. But Rockefeller didn't lose. The panic it created gave him something priceless: fear. By the time the dust settled, small refiners were terrified that Standard Oil had more secret alliances, more railroad leverage, more unseen power waiting in the dark. They rushed to sell out to Rockefeller, often at humiliating prices. In a furious 6-week period, later called the Cleveland Massacre, Standard Oil absorbed 22 out of 26 refineries in the city. Rockefeller's empire was no longer growing, it was consuming. He expanded to Pittsburgh, New York, Philadelphia. He cut costs by installing the latest equipment. He bought barrel factories, warehouses, chemicals, glue factories, docks, every piece of the supply chain that touched oil. Most importantly, he began constructing a vast network of pipelines. Long metallic veins running across states, carrying oil straight to refineries and refineries straight to markets. The railroads, once kings of transportation, realized with horror that their biggest customer was building a system that would eventually make them obsolete. Newspapers began calling Standard Oil the octopus. Its tentacles reached everywhere. It bought politicians, it broke rivals, it dictated prices, it suffocated anything that resisted. And at its center sat John D. Rockefeller, calm, reserved, unreadable, conducting the entire machine with the meticulous precision of a conductor leading an orchestra. By the mid-1870s, he controlled nearly the entire refining industry of America. But he was not yet satisfied, because to maintain such an empire, he would have to fight not just businessmen, but giants, railroad titans, steel barons, and eventually, the President of the United States. By the late 1870s, Standard Oil was no longer a company. It was a force of nature, silent, organized, relentless. But as Rockefeller's influence expanded, so did the number of powerful men who felt threatened by him. And some of these men were not wildcatters or small refiners. They were industrial giants, railroad barons, steel kings, political heavyweights, titans of the new American age. The first and most dangerous of these new enemies was the Pennsylvania Railroad, led by the formidable Tom Scott. For decades, the railroads had been the beating heart of American industry. They stretched across the nation like steel arteries, carrying oil, coal, steel, timber, and people from coast to coast. But Rockefeller's pipelines were a cancer inside that system, growing, spreading, threatening to render entire railroad divisions obsolete. Scott understood this, and Rockefeller knew that Scott understood. When the Pennsylvania Railroad announced plans to build its own pipelines, and more provocatively, its own oil refineries, it crossed an invisible line. Until now, Rockefeller had used railroads, controlled railroads, manipulated railroads, but never confronted them directly. Scott's move was a challenge, a declaration that Standard Oil could not control everything. Rockefeller responded with cold precision. He rerouted all Standard Oil shipments away from the Pennsylvania Railroad overnight. Thousands of barrels vanished from Pennsylvania lines. Millions of dollars evaporated from Pennsylvania ledgers. The railroad scrambled to fill the gap, but cancellations spread through its network like frost devouring a crop. Then Rockefeller cut the price of kerosene, not because he needed to, but because it forced competitors and their railroad partners to slash theirs as well. Scott watched helplessly as revenue from oil transport fell to nearly nothing. Finally, Rockefeller convinced the New York Central and Erie railroads to drop their rates to absurdly low levels, rates that undercut Pennsylvania railroads so brutally that Scott's business was bleeding out faster than he could react. The consequences were catastrophic. The Pennsylvania Railroad slashed wages by 10%, then 20%, then more. Workers revolted. Anger ignited like dry brush. In 1877, a strike erupted in Pittsburgh that spiraled into one of the most violent labor uprisings in American history. Rioters torched railroad yards, rail cars exploded, locomotives melted into twisted heaps of steel. Entire sections of track glowed red with heat. In Pittsburgh alone, 39 buildings were destroyed and over 100 locomotives burned to the ground. Dozens died. And while Rockefeller never intended violence, he could not ignore the message. His war with Scott was not a business dispute. It was a battle that could tear the country apart. The Pennsylvania Railroad collapsed into crisis. Tom Scott, once one of the most powerful men in America, was humiliated, weakened, and increasingly desperate. Meanwhile, Rockefeller remained eerily calm, refusing to let emotion interfere with strategy. In time, a truce was negotiated. Rockefeller agreed to send nearly half of Standard Oil's traffic back to the Pennsylvania Railroad, but only under conditions heavily favoring him. He demanded enormous secret rebates, detailed intelligence on competitor shipments, and payments on every barrel moved through the line. The agreement helped the Pennsylvania survive, but it destroyed Tom Scott. Broken in spirit, exhausted by defeat, he suffered a stroke and died shortly afterward. His protege, Andrew Carnegie, never forgave Rockefeller. Carnegie had adored Scott, seeing him as a mentor and almost a second father. To him, Rockefeller's victory was not a feat of strategy, but an act of cruelty. And so began a rivalry between two men who would soon stand as the wealthiest Americans who had ever lived. The Steel King versus the Oil King, locked not in open warfare, but in a silent competition for supremacy. Yet while Carnegie fought with mills and furnaces, Rockefeller had already begun expanding his empire in unexpected ways. A vast new oil field erupted in northern Ohio. Most refiners dismissed the oil as useless because its fumes were so foul that locals nicknamed it skunk oil. But Rockefeller, as always, saw opportunity where others saw failure. He assembled a team of chemists who worked tirelessly until they developed a method to remove the sulfur and neutralize the odor. Within a year, Standard Oil was the only company able and willing to refine the region's oil. More discoveries followed: Oklahoma, Kansas, Texas, California. The American continent was swimming in petroleum. And with each discovery, Standard Oil's reach expanded further. Pipelines snaked across the land. Storage tanks rose like industrial monuments. Refineries grew, modernized, multiplied. Then came an even bigger shift: the rise of the automobile. The internal combustion engine transformed gasoline from a waste byproduct of kerosene production into a high-demand commodity. Standard Oil didn't just adapt, it capitalized, turning mountains of previously discarded gasoline into streams of profit. While the nation embraced automobiles, Rockefeller's influence spread into railroads, mines, real estate, and banking. He made investments through agents and intermediaries, masking his identity so thoroughly that even some of his partners didn't know they were working for him. Much of this expansion was orchestrated not by Rockefeller himself, who had begun stepping back from daily operations, but by two men who shaped his financial future: Frederick T. Gates, his brilliant investment manager, and John Rockefeller Jr., his disciplined and increasingly capable son. Together, Gates and Jr. took Rockefeller's scattered investments and transformed them into a towering financial empire. They bought railroads, land, and countless businesses. Their boldest purchase was a massive deposit of iron ore in the Mesabi Range of Minnesota, one of the richest veins in North America. The moment Carnegie heard this, he panicked. If Rockefeller entered the steel business, the consequences would be catastrophic. He had already destroyed one railroad titan. Carnegie feared he might be next. So Carnegie and Rockefeller engaged in a delicate dance, posturing, threatening, maneuvering, until J.P. Morgan intervened. Morgan, the nation's most powerful banker, pushed for peace. He urged the two titans to negotiate, and surprisingly, they did. Rockefeller agreed not to build steel mills. Carnegie agreed to buy huge quantities of Rockefeller's iron ore. A temporary peace settled over the industrial landscape, but this calm would not last. For as Rockefeller withdrew from daily business, another storm was forming, one far more dangerous than any industrial rival. It came not from the oil fields or railroads, but from a journalist. A woman with a pen sharper than any sword. A woman driven by a personal vendetta buried in her childhood. Her name was Ida Tarbell, and she would soon drag John D. Rockefeller into the center of the most devastating public scandal of his life. When the 20th century dawned, John D. Rockefeller was no longer merely an oil baron. He was a myth, a whisper. A looming shadow stretched across the American economy. His pipelines crisscrossed states like a metallic web. His refineries glowed through the night like industrial citadels. His agents monitored competitors with a precision bordering on espionage. Nearly every gallon of kerosene burned in American lamps had passed through his hands. But absolute power has a price, and Rockefeller was about to pay it. For decades, newspapers had speculated about the man behind Standard Oil. Some feared him, some admired him, most never saw him at all. Rockefeller rarely gave interviews. He moved like a ghost, quiet, controlled, careful. But the public mood began to shift as stories leaked of bribed officials, railroad conspiracies, secret rate rebates, and ruthless buyouts. Rumors swelled, anger simmered, and then a woman stepped forward who would turn that anger into a national fire. Ida Minerva Tarbell, a meticulous investigative journalist, had a reason to despise Standard Oil that went far deeper than professional duty. When she was a young girl, her father's small refinery, built with years of sweat and sacrifice, was crushed by Rockefeller's predatory tactics. She remembered his despair. She remembered neighbors ruined. She remembered families torn apart. Now, as a grown woman, she sharpened her pen with one goal: to expose the empire that had shattered her childhood. Tarbell spent years gathering records, interviewing former Standard Oil employees, and tracking down confidential correspondence from railroad companies. What she uncovered astonished even her editors. The deals, the threats, the espionage, the price wars designed specifically to bleed rivals dry, the secret ownership of competitors, the political pressure applied quietly but relentlessly. When her serialized investigation, The History of the Standard Oil Company, began publication, America devoured it. Tarbell wrote with both precision and fury. She crafted Rockefeller not as a businessman, but as a calculating villain, an industrial spider spinning an inescapable web. The public, already suspicious, erupted in outrage. Rockefeller's silence made it worse. To press inquiries, he simply replied, "Not a word, not a single word." But silence was no longer an option, because Ida Tarbell had done more than damage his reputation. She had given President Theodore Roosevelt the perfect enemy. Roosevelt had built his political career on the promise of breaking corporate monopolies, the trusts that dominated America. But he needed a target big enough to make the movement unforgettable. Standard Oil was perfect, and Rockefeller, already the wealthiest man alive, was a villain made for headlines. Roosevelt launched a historic antitrust crusade. For years, Standard Oil had evaded every attempt to regulate or prosecute it. But now, the full machinery of the federal government turned its sights on Rockefeller. Investigators raided offices. Lawyers subpoenaed thousands of documents. A tidal wave of lawsuits swept across state lines. The federal case against Standard Oil was a monster. 12,000 pages of evidence, 444 witnesses, thousands of exhibits. Rockefeller, now in his 60s and mostly retired, watched from the shadows as his life's creation was dissected, piece by piece, in the courtroom of public opinion. For the first time in his adult life, John D. Rockefeller could not control the battlefield, and the result was inevitable. In 1911, the Supreme Court declared Standard Oil an illegal monopoly. It ordered the company to be broken into 34 independent corporations. To Rockefeller's enemies, this was triumph, a victory for justice, a symbolic slaying of the corporate Goliath. Newspapers celebrated, politicians cheered, crowds rejoiced as if witnessing the fall of a tyrant. But they were wrong, because this defeat became the greatest financial victory of Rockefeller's career. When Standard Oil split, shareholders received stock in all the new companies. Rockefeller, who owned roughly 25% of the original corporation, suddenly held large stakes in 34 separate oil companies, many of which would grow into giants of their own. ExxonMobil, Chevron, Amoco, Conoco, Marathon, Oil Arco, and many others. Investors rushed to buy shares in the newly freed companies, believing each one could become the next Standard Oil. Stock prices exploded. Rockefeller's wealth tripled almost overnight. By the end of 1912, he was worth an estimated $900 million, the equivalent of tens of billions today. Within a few years, he quietly crossed into unprecedented territory. John D. Rockefeller became the world's first billionaire. Andrew Carnegie, once a rival, now lagged hopelessly behind. J.P. Morgan, the titan of finance, could not match him. Rockefeller had not only survived the government's attack, he had emerged richer than ever. But he was an old man now, and the empire he had built was no longer his to command. So Rockefeller did something few expected. He turned away from business and toward humanity. Throughout his life, Rockefeller had donated small sums to Baptist churches, missionary groups, and educational causes. But now he approached philanthropy with the same discipline, intensity, and strategic genius that had defined Standard Oil. He hired Frederick Gates, the brilliant advisor who had helped manage his investments, along with his son, John D. Rockefeller Jr. Together, they designed a new type of giving, scientific philanthropy, not emotional giving, not random charity, but targeted intervention. Rockefeller funded laboratories, universities, medical schools, public health campaigns, and global initiatives. He believed disease and ignorance were enemies just as real as business competitors, enemies that could be defeated with organization, research, and money. His contributions transformed the world. He nearly eradicated hookworm in the American South, lifting millions out of poverty. He funded research that led to breakthroughs in malaria, yellow fever, and meningitis. He built the University of Chicago, which became one of the world's leading research institutions. He established the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, now Rockefeller University. He funded thousands of schools through the General Education Board. He sent medical missions across the globe. He donated land for New York's Riverside Church and backed countless cultural foundations. By the time of his death, Rockefeller had personally given away $540 million, more than any human in history up to that point. The foundation that bore his name would give away billions more in the decades to follow, shaping modern medicine, public health, and education in ways still felt today. And yet, even as his legacy of generosity grew, the darker chapters of his life did not vanish. Historians struggled to reconcile the twin nature of the man. Was he the ruthless monopolist who crushed competitors without remorse? Or the benevolent philanthropist who saved millions of lives? Biographers often said that John D. Rockefeller lived two lives, one built on iron and one built on mercy. Perhaps that contradiction was the true source of his power. He embodied the violent birth of American capitalism, but also its capacity for immense good. He lived long enough to see his fortune reshape the world, long enough to watch industries rise that he had pioneered, long enough to see his children and grandchildren take roles he once held. On May 23, 1937, at age 97, John D. Rockefeller passed away. At his funeral, his son, John D. Rockefeller Jr., was asked what it felt like to inherit the legacy of one of history's most powerful men. He paused and answered quietly, "There was only ever one John D. Rockefeller." Whether he meant it as admiration or fear or simply truth, no one could be sure. But the world understood the message. Rockefeller was not merely a businessman, not merely a philanthropist, not merely a symbol. He was the industrial age itself, its ambition, its brutality, its genius, its contradictions, compressed into one extraordinary, impossible life. And his shadow still stretches across the modern world.